My parents forced me to compete against my brother for the right to exist. When I begged them to stop after 12 years of starving and sleeping in the garage, my mom smiled and said, "Let's see if you finally learn to fight for something that matters." I didn't say a word. That was 9 months ago. Last night, she locked herself in the bathroom and cried so quietly I almost missed it. How did your parents pit their kids against each other? Every morning, my parents made me and my younger brother compete for the right to be acknowledged as their child that day, because they believed only one of us could receive their love at a time. The loser had to pretend they didn't exist and wasn't allowed to speak, eat at the table, or even make eye contact with anyone until tomorrow's competition. My parents were behavioral psychologists who developed this theory that dividing parental affection created stronger, more independent children who wouldn't grow up needy or codependent. They'd published papers about selective attachment parenting, using fake data, and ran workshops for other twisted parents who wanted to emotionally destroy their kids in the name of science. They started this system when my brother Caleb was born, and I was 4 years old. At first, the competitions were simple, like who could stay quiet longest or who drew the better picture. The winner got to sit on mom's lap and call her mommy, while the loser had to sit in the corner and watch. By the time I was 12 and Caleb was 8, the competitions had evolved into complex psychological warfare. We'd have to give presentations about why we deserved love more than our sibling, complete with PowerPoint slides listing each other's failures. The winner got a bedroom and the loser slept in the garage. The winner got 3 meals and the loser got whatever scraps were left. I couldn't do it to Caleb because he was just a little kid who needed his parents. So I threw every competition and spent years being invisible in my own home. I'd watch him eat dinner with our parents while I stood in the corner facing the wall because losers weren't allowed to contaminate family time with their presence. He'd try to sneak me food, but Dad would stop him saying, "Winners don't share with losers. That's how you become a loser too." Some nights Caleb would cry and beg them to let me join, but they'd explain that acknowledging my existence would weaken his development. The competitions got crueler as Caleb grew older and started understanding what winning meant for me. They made us write essays about why our sibling didn't deserve parental love and read them aloud. They forced us to destroy each other's possessions to prove we valued victory over sentiment. During one competition, they made us choose which family photos to burn, and Caleb sobbed as he threw pictures of us together into the fire. I kept losing on purpose, but it was killing me to watch my sweet brother slowly realize he had to hurt me to keep our parents' love. He started apologizing through his bedroom wall at night when he thought they couldn't hear. I found ways to secretly take care of Caleb without our parents knowing. I'd leave lunch money in his backpack and forge permission slips for his field trips. When he got sick, I'd sneak him medicine and leave it where he'd find it. I wanted him to know he was loved, even if I couldn't say it out loud. For months, I thought I was protecting him from the worst of their system by taking all the rejection myself. He still had parents who hugged him and helped with homework and came to his soccer games while I had learned to be completely self-sufficient and invisible. But our parents had cameras everywhere and had been documenting what they called my pathological need to nurture weakness. They confronted me with footage of every secret kindness and accused me of sabotaging their parenting method. "You're creating codependency," Mom screamed while showing clips of me sneaking Caleb food. "You're ruining our research." They decided my refusal to compete properly meant I needed more extreme motivation. They announced that next month's competition would be final, and the loser would be legally emancipated and removed from the family forever. The winner would inherit everything and become their only child. Caleb broke down completely when they explained the new rules. He begged me to actually try this time because he couldn't lose me. "Please win," he sobbed that night through the wall. "I don't want to be their only kid. I just want my sister." But I knew they'd rigged it so I couldn't win. They'd been planning this all along, documenting years of evidence that I was unfit to be their child. The competition would just be theater to traumatize Caleb into never showing weakness again. I had 2 weeks to figure out how to save my brother from spending the rest of his childhood alone with parents who saw him as an experiment. I started recording everything with a hidden camera I'd bought, pretending to prepare for the competition while actually building evidence. I documented them coaching Caleb on what to say to destroy me and forging psychological evaluations claiming I was dangerous. The night before the final competition, I heard them in their office finalizing adoption papers for after my removal. They were planning to adopt a new child to compete against Caleb because single children become complacent without competition. I tried to run with Caleb, but they'd anticipated that and had already filed papers claiming I was kidnapping him. When morning came, they gathered us in the living room for our final competition. Caleb was shaking and could barely look at me. Dad set up his camera while Mom laid out the rules one last time. As she spoke, I noticed the doorbell camera had been disabled and their phones were turned off. They'd made sure no one could interrupt what they'd planned. Mom smiled at me with dead eyes and said, "Let's see if you finally learn to fight for something that matters." That's when I saw Dad pull out a locked metal box from behind his chair. "Winner gets what's inside," he said. "Loser gets what they deserve." I stared at the metal box while Dad clicked it open and pulled out a thick stack of papers that he waved in front of us like a trophy. The emancipation forms already had my name typed at the top in bold letters, not blank spaces for whoever lost, and my stomach dropped as I realized they'd never planned for any outcome except me leaving. Mom stood up with her clipboard and announced we'd each present our case for why we deserved to remain in the family, starting with me since I was older and should set the example. Caleb started sobbing and shaking his head, begging them to stop this, saying he didn't want to compete anymore, but Mom just wrote something on her clipboard about emotional weakness while Dad set up 3 different cameras around the room. He adjusted each angle carefully and told us this was the most important documentation of their research, the moment that would prove their methods worked, and I understood they needed footage of Caleb destroying me for their academic presentations. Mom pointed at me to begin my presentation, so I stood up on shaky legs and started talking about why I wanted to stay, deliberately stumbling over my words and looking weak while secretly pressing record on my phone's camera app. I positioned myself so the phone in my pocket could capture both my parents, as Dad leaned over to whisper something to Caleb about showing strength or they'd both be removed from the family. Caleb suddenly jumped up and screamed that he wouldn't do it anymore, that he hated what they'd made him become, and Dad grabbed his arm hard enough to leave marks while forcing him back into his chair. Mom calmly stated that this defiance proved their method hadn't worked on either child, and they'd need to start over with better subjects, and I watched my sweet little brother finally break after years of being forced to hurt me. Their wedding photo fell off the wall with a loud crash, and Mom declared a recess, grabbing Caleb by the shoulders and marching him to his room room, while Dad followed with one of the cameras. Through the thin walls, I heard them telling him that if he didn't complete the competition properly, they'd have both of us removed and adopt 2 new children who would appreciate the opportunity. I held my phone against the wall to record everything, hearing Mom explain that he had 5 minutes to decide if he wanted to be an only child or an orphan. While they worked on Caleb, I quickly uploaded all my recordings to 3 different cloud services and scheduled emails to Ms. Foster, my school counselor, for Monday morning at 8 with links to everything. I heard Caleb's voice, hollow and dead, agreeing to continue, and I knew I had to endure whatever came next to protect him from being alone with them. They brought him back to the living room, and the competition resumed with Caleb standing there like a robot, reading from index cards Dad had written for him. His hands shook as he read that every sacrifice I'd made was actually weakness, that my kindness was pathological codependency, that I was unfit to be anyone's family, and I forced myself to look hurt even though I felt proud he was surviving this. When it was my turn for rebuttal, I made my voice crack and gave weak arguments about loving my family while Mom scribbled notes about my inability to defend myself, and Dad commented that my failure to compete properly validated their research about creating resilient children. I noticed Caleb mouthing, "I'm sorry," when they weren't looking at him, his eyes red and puffy from crying. They declared Caleb the winner and handed me the emancipation papers to sign, the forms already notarized and ready, except for my signature. As I reached for the pen, I asked if I could say goodbye to my brother properly since this would be the last time we'd see each other. Mom said losers don't get goodbyes, but I insisted it was important for Caleb's development to have proper closure with failed family members. She rolled her eyes but nodded, probably thinking it would make good footage for their research. I pulled Caleb into a tight hug and whispered in his ear that I'd recorded everything, that help was coming, that he just needed to be strong for a few more days. I'm trying to understand how parents who study behavior could miss how much damage they're causing their own kids. The way they turned love into a competition and made these siblings destroy each other is so confusing to me. I signed my name on the papers while Dad filmed every second, both of them believing they were documenting their greatest success. Caleb clung to me desperately until Dad grabbed his shoulders and physically pulled us apart, telling him that winners don't mourn losers. Mom looked at her watch and announced I had exactly 1 hour to pack my things while she stood in my doorway, making sure I didn't take anything that belonged to the family. I grabbed my old backpack and started throwing in clothes while she watched with her clipboard, checking off items like she was doing inventory. Dad pulled Caleb into his office, and I could hear him explaining that if Caleb ever tried to contact me or even looked at me if we passed on the street, he'd be removed from the family too. My hands shook as I folded my shirts and tried to decide what to leave behind for Caleb to find later. I left my favorite hoodie on the bed, knowing he'd take it when they weren't looking. Mom followed me to the bathroom and watched me pack my toothbrush and the cheap shampoo I'd bought with babysitting money. She wouldn't let me take the towels or the hairdryer because those belonged to the house. I packed my school notebooks and the hidden camera I'd been using to record them, wrapping it carefully in a sock. Mom made me leave my laptop because Dad had bought it for schoolwork, and losers didn't get to keep family purchases. I slipped Caleb's favorite book under his pillow when Mom turned to check her phone. She saw me near his room and reminded me that entering family spaces was now trespassing. I had 20 minutes left and almost nothing to pack because most of what filled my room had been bought by them and therefore wasn't really mine. I grabbed the emergency cash I'd hidden inside an old textbook and the phone I'd bought myself with money from tutoring kids at school. Mom watched me count the money and wrote down the amount on her clipboard. I took my birth certificate and social security card from the folder where I kept important papers, knowing I'd need them. Mom tried to take them, saying they were family documents, but I held tight and told her those were legally mine. She made a note on her clipboard about my defiance. I could hear Caleb crying in Dad's office and Dad telling him that tears were manipulation and he needed to be stronger than that. I wanted to run to him, but Mom blocked the doorway. I finished packing with 10 minutes to spare and sat on my stripped bed waiting for noon. Mom stood there the whole time, not saying anything, just watching me like I was some experiment she was observing. At exactly noon, she walked me to the front door where Dad was already taking down my photos from the wall and dropping them into a garbage bag. Caleb stood frozen in the corner of the living room, his face red and puffy from crying, not allowed to move or speak or even wave goodbye. I walked out with my single backpack and heard the deadbolt click behind me. I'd set up emails to send automatically to Ms. Foster, my school counselor, in 48 hours with all the recordings and evidence unless I canceled them. 2 hours later, I knocked on Jenna's door and her mom answered looking worried because Jenna had already told her some of what was happening. They let me in and gave me the guest room they'd prepared with fresh sheets and towels. Jenna's mom kept asking if she should call the police right now, but I explained that my parents were smart and manipulative and would convince everyone I was a troubled teen making things up. I asked for just 2 days to handle things the right way with the evidence I'd gathered. That night, I lay in the guest bed checking my phone every few minutes, hoping somehow Caleb would find a way to message me. I knew my parents had his phone and his computer, but maybe he'd use a friend's device or sneak onto a school computer. I pulled out my hidden camera and laptop Jenna's family let me borrow to review all the footage I'd recorded over the past weeks. I had hours of them coaching Caleb on what to say, planning the rigged competition, discussing their plans to adopt a new child to continue their experiments. Sunday morning, I helped Jenna's mom make pancakes and tried to act normal, even though my stomach was in knots thinking about Caleb alone with them. Jenna's dad came down for breakfast and mentioned he was a lawyer who did mostly business contracts, but knew family law basics. He asked to see the emancipation papers and started reading them at the kitchen table. His face got more and more serious as he read, and finally he looked up and said these papers were filed 3 weeks ago, not yesterday. He spread them out on the table and pointed to dates and signatures showing my parents had been planning this for weeks and had lied to the court about me living independently for 6 months. He said this kind of fraud could void the whole emancipation and potentially be criminal abuse. He started taking photos of every page and making notes about the false statements. He found a section where my parents claimed I'd been paying rent and buying my own food for 6 months when actually I'd never been allowed to have a job or money. He called his colleague who specialized in family law and emergency custody cases, and they talked for an hour about legal options. Sunday afternoon, I was helping Jenna with her homework when her phone rang with an unknown number. It was Caleb calling from the neighbor's phone during his supervised outdoor time in the backyard. He was crying so hard I could barely understand him saying our parents had already contacted 3 adoption agencies and had meetings scheduled for Tuesday. He He said they were calling it an expedited placement for a child in need of structure. I told him to be brave for one more day and that I was working on getting him out. He said they'd been making him practice his introduction speech for the new sibling and how he'd teach them the competition rules. Jenna's dad spent the rest of Sunday afternoon helping me organize everything into a comprehensive evidence package. We labeled each recording with dates and descriptions and created a timeline showing 12 years of documented abuse. He contacted another colleague who'd handled emergency custody cases, and they planned to file everything first thing Monday morning when the courthouse opened. We made multiple copies of everything and stored them in different places in case something happened to the originals. Sunday evening, Jenna's mom made dinner, but I couldn't eat anything knowing Caleb was alone with them. I kept checking my phone, worried they'd found out about the neighbor's phone or discovered my hidden cameras. Jenna sat with me at the table, not saying much, but staying close while I wrote out a detailed timeline of every incident I could remember. Her dad helped me organize it by date and severity, highlighting the worst incidents that would get immediate attention from authorities. We worked until midnight preparing everything for Monday morning. At exactly 6 a.m. Monday, my scheduled emails sent automatically to Ms. Foster with all the recordings and a detailed explanation of what had been happening. I decided not to cancel them because I wanted multiple people aware in case my parents tried to interfere with a legal filing. I sat at Jenna's kitchen table watching the clock and waiting for school to start so Ms. Foster would see the emails. At 8:30, my phone buzzed and Ms. Foster's name appeared on the screen. I grabbed it so fast I almost dropped it on the floor. Her voice was shaking when she started talking, and she kept stopping to take deep breaths. She said she'd already called CPS and the school resource officer after listening to just the first recording. She told me to stay at Jenna's house because authorities were already moving on this. My hands were trembling as I thanked her and felt this weird mix of relief and terror about what would happen next. Right after we hung up, she called back to tell me something else. Caleb's school had just contacted her office because my parents called him in sick today. This made my stomach drop because my parents never missed work and never let Caleb miss school for anything. They had perfect attendance at their university jobs and made Caleb go to school even with fevers. Ms. Foster said she was calling CPS right back to report this as possible immediate danger. 2 hours later, at exactly 10 o'clock, someone knocked on Jenna's front door. A woman in a gray pantsuit stood there holding a folder and introduced herself as Linda Morrison from CPS. She came inside and sat across from me at the kitchen table where I'd been waiting. Her face got more and more upset as she looked through the evidence I'd prepared. I handed her the USB drive with all the recordings and showed her the 12 years of documentation I'd collected. She wrote down everything I told her about the competitions and the garage sleeping and the corner standing. Her pen moved faster and faster across her notepad as I explained how it all worked. She kept shaking her head and asking me to repeat certain parts like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Then she pulled out her phone and started making calls right there at the table. She talked to someone about coordinating an emergency welfare check on my brother within the hour. She explained they had evidence of ongoing abuse and a child potentially in immediate danger. I begged her to let me come with them to get Caleb, but she said I needed to stay somewhere safe. While she was still on the phone, it rang with another call coming through. Her face changed completely as she listened to whoever was talking. She looked at me and mouthed the words, "Your mother," while the person kept talking. When she hung up, she told me my mother had just filed a missing person report claiming I was dangerous to myself and others. She said my parents were claiming I had mental health issues and needed immediate psychiatric help. What made them plan this 3 weeks early and lie about dates on legal papers? The way they filmed everything like it was some big win while secretly planning it all along makes me wonder what else they've been hiding in their research notes about their own kids. The emancipation papers they'd threatened me with were never actually filed with any court. I realized right then that they were trying to get me locked up in a mental hospital to keep me quiet. Linda said we needed to go to the police station immediately to sort this out before my parents convinced someone to issue a psychiatric hold. She drove me there in her county car and walked me inside through the back entrance. A detective named Rivera met us in a small interview room and started reviewing all my evidence. About an hour later, I heard my parents' voices in the hallway outside. They were putting on this big show about their troubled daughter who had run away and was having delusions. Through the door, I could hear my dad using his professor voice to sound calm and reasonable. My mom was crying and talking about how worried they were about my mental state. Detective Rivera left to talk to them, and I watched through the window as they lied with complete confidence. They had brought a whole folder of what looked like medical documents and psychiatric evaluations. My dad kept pointing at the papers and shaking his head sadly like he was so concerned. Ms. Foster showed up at the station with a box of my school records and transcripts. She went straight to Detective Rivera and showed him 4 years of perfect attendance and honor roll grades. She told him about my volunteer work and tutoring other students and how I'd never had a single disciplinary issue. She mentioned things she'd noticed about my family that had concerned her over the years. The detective started asking my parents harder questions after talking to Ms. Foster. My dad pulled out copies of their published research papers about selective attachment parenting to prove they were respected professionals. He claimed I was jealous of Caleb and had made up these abuse stories for attention. Detective Rivera asked him directly why respected psychologists would make their children compete for affection. My dad started explaining their theories, but even I could tell the detective wasn't buying it anymore. While my parents were being interviewed in separate rooms, I could hear my mom talking to another officer in the hallway. She was telling him I'd been harming myself and showing signs of serious mental illness for months. She said they'd been trying to get me help, but I kept refusing treatment and becoming more paranoid. I realized they had created an entire fake medical history to make me look crazy. I asked Linda if I could call Jenna's dad since he was a lawyer and could maybe help me. Around 2 in the afternoon, the door to the station opened and 2 officers came in with Caleb. He looked so small and scared and wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. When he saw me sitting in the interview room, he broke away from the officers and ran straight to me. He grabbed onto me and started sobbing so hard his whole body was shaking. I could see bruises on both his arms where his sleeves had pulled up. My dad immediately said the bruises were from rough play and that Caleb was just being dramatic. But the way Caleb was clinging to me and crying told everyone in that room a completely different story. Linda Morrison stepped between us and my parents while another woman with kind eyes and gray hair gently took Caleb's hand and led him to a different room down the hall. My dad started to follow, but 2 officers blocked his path and told him to sit back down. Linda explained that Caleb needed to be interviewed separately with a child specialist present to ensure his statements weren't influenced by anyone else in the room. My mom's face went completely white when she heard this. and she grabbed my dad's arm so hard her knuckles turned white. They kept looking at each other with these panicked expressions while Linda set up a video camera to record everything. The specialist, who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen, had this calm way of talking that seemed to help Caleb stop shaking as she asked him simple questions about school and his favorite subjects first. I could see everything on a monitor Linda had set up and watched Caleb slowly relax as Dr. Chen asked about his daily routine at home. At first, he kept saying exactly what I knew our parents had taught him to say about how they were good parents who just had high standards and how I was confused about their methods. But then Linda pulled out her laptop and showed him something on the screen that made his whole body go rigid. It was the recording I'd made of our parents in their office talking about his upcoming recalibration after I was removed from the family. They were discussing how they'd need to break his dependency on me through intensive isolation therapy and create a new competition dynamic with the adopted child they were planning to bring in. Caleb's face crumpled as he heard our mother say he was getting too soft and needed to be reset to baseline emotional responses. He started crying again, and this time he couldn't stop as he told Dr. Chen everything about the daily competitions and how he had to hurt me to get food or a bed or even eye contact from our parents. Linda and I were moved to a small conference room while the authorities figured out what to do next, and Caleb was brought in to wait with me after his interview ended. He pressed himself against my side and whispered that Mom and Dad had made him memorize a whole story about how I was mentally unstable and had been making up lies about them for attention. Then he rolled up his sleeves and showed me his arms where I could see finger-shaped bruises that spelled out the word weak pressed into his skin. Linda came back in and saw the bruises and immediately took photos with her phone while documenting the pattern and measuring them with a ruler she pulled from her bag. She left again, and we could hear shouting from down the hall where my mother was screaming about her parental rights and threatening to sue everyone involved for kidnapping and defamation. The door to our conference room had a small window, and I saw her trying to push past the officers to get to us while yelling that I'd brainwashed Caleb and demanding he be returned to her immediately. Her perfect professional composure was completely gone, and her face was twisted with this cold rage I'd only seen a few times before when she thought no one was watching. My dad was on his phone calling someone, and I heard him mention their lawyer's name before an officer took his phone away. The detective who'd been questioning them came into our room around 4 p.m. and told Linda he'd discovered something important while checking the court records. The emancipation papers my parents had made me sign during the final competition weren't filed anywhere in the system and appeared to be completely fake documents they'd created themselves. This meant they'd filed a false missing person report when they knew exactly where I was and had attempted fraud by creating fake legal documents. He said he was preparing criminal charges while CPS pursued emergency custody removal and that both my parents were now being detained for questioning. When the police got a warrant to search my dad's phone, they found emails with 3 different adoption agencies dated 2 weeks before our final competition, which proved they'd been planning my removal the whole time. One agency had already selected a 7-year-old boy for placement, and my parents had paid a deposit to hold him until after I was gone. Dr. James Hartley from the University Ethics Board showed up around 5 p.m. after the detective had contacted him about my parents' research papers. He brought a thick folder of documents and told Linda he'd been investigating my parents for 6 months after finding statistical impossibilities in their published data that suggested they were fabricating their results. Their entire body of academic work on selective attachment parenting appeared to be fraudulent, and they'd been using fake test subjects in their studies while actually experimenting on me and Caleb without any oversight or consent. By 6 p.m., Linda had arranged for me and Caleb to be placed in emergency foster care together for the night with a woman named Carol who lived about 20 minutes away. Carol was in her 50s with soft hands and a gentle voice, but neither of us could eat the spaghetti she made for dinner, even though she kept encouraging us to try. We sat pressed together on her couch, wrapped in the same blanket, and I realized this was the first time in 8 years that Caleb and I had been allowed to comfort each other without being punished for showing weakness. That evening, Dr. Hartley met with university lawyers to review all my recordings, and the evidence showed that my parents had used us as unwilling test subjects while publishing completely fabricated data about their made-up research subjects. The university started preparing to terminate their positions immediately and retract every paper they'd ever published, while also considering criminal referrals for research fraud. Tuesday morning came too fast, and we were driven to the courthouse for an emergency custody hearing where both my parents showed up with expensive lawyers in dark suits. They tried to claim the entire situation was a misunderstanding and that their unconventional but effective parenting methods had been mischaracterized by people who didn't understand behavioral science. Judge Patricia Wells was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes who reviewed the evidence with her mouth getting tighter and tighter as she read through the documents. When it was time for testimony, they had Caleb speak through a closed-circuit video link from another room so he wouldn't have to see our parents while he talked. He broke down completely as he described the daily competitions and the forced invisibility and how hungry he was when he lost and had to watch me eat. His voice cracked when he said the words, "I'll never forget as long as I live," about having to hurt me every single day just to get dinner. How did Rivera know to start asking harder questions after talking to Ms. Foster? The way Caleb ran straight to his sister instead of his parents really shows who made him feel safe. Judge Wells called for a recess, and I could see her hands shaking as she stood up and left the courtroom looking more upset than any adult I'd ever seen in a position of authority. During the recess, I headed to the bathroom but stopped when I heard voices from a conference room with a door cracked open. My parents' lawyer was talking to them about strategy, and I pressed myself against the wall to listen better. "We could claim the children have shared delusional disorder," the lawyer said while shuffling papers. "Two kids isolated together for years could easily feed off each other's fantasies and create false memories that seem real to them both." My stomach dropped as I heard my mother agree that it was brilliant, and my father started listing psychological terms to support it. They were going to try to have us locked up in some mental hospital rather than admit what they'd done to us. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and texted the only adult who might help, a professor named James who'd been investigating my parents' research fraud. Within minutes, he texted back that he was calling his lawyer friend who specialized in protecting kids, and they'd be at the courthouse as fast as possible. I ran back to find Caleb in the waiting area and told him to stay close to Ms. Foster no matter what happened next. When court resumed an hour later, a man in an expensive suit walked in and announced he was representing both children with emergency authorization from Child Services. My parents' lawyer objected, but the judge allowed it after reviewing his credentials and seeing the psychiatric psychiatric evaluation request my parents had just filed, claiming we were both mentally unstable. The new lawyer immediately asked for an independent evaluation by a court-appointed child psychiatrist instead of whoever my parents wanted to hire. Judge Wells agreed and called in Dr. Kim Chen, who happened to be available that afternoon to evaluate us during another recess. Dr. Chen interviewed me first in a quiet room, asking about specific events and checking if my story stayed consistent when she asked the same questions different ways. She had me draw diagrams of our house layout and describe exact details of the competitions that only someone who lived it would know. Then she interviewed Caleb separately for over an hour, while I waited outside chewing my nails down to nothing. When we returned to the courtroom, Dr. Chen testified that we were both traumatized but completely lucid, with no signs of delusion or shared fantasy. She explained that our accounts matched in specific details, but differed in personal perspectives exactly as you'd expect from two real witnesses to the same events. She said the idea of shared delusional disorder was clinically impossible given the evidence, the consistency of our stories, and the physical proof that supported everything we'd said. My mother took the stand next, sitting straight-backed in her designer suit and speaking in her professor voice like she was giving a lecture. She called us research subjects who've confused experimental parameters with reality, and claimed every video I'd recorded was taken out of context from therapeutic role-playing exercises designed to build resilience. She said the competitions were actually structured play therapy, and that we'd misunderstood the purpose because children often can't distinguish between games and reality. Even her own lawyer looked uncomfortable as she kept talking about us like we were lab rats instead of her kids, using clinical terms to describe our behavioral responses and attachment patterns. I watched her lie with such calm confidence that for a second I actually questioned if maybe I had imagined how bad it was. Then I saw Caleb unconsciously rubbing the bruises on his arms from where Dad had grabbed him during the last competition, and I remembered every night he'd cried through the walls begging me to answer him. I remembered the hunger and the silence and the corner I'd stood in for hours, and I found my strength in knowing I had to protect him from ever going back to that. Judge Wells asked my mother directly if she loved her children, and Mom paused before saying, "I'm invested in their optimal development," which made several people in the courtroom gasp. The judge's face turned red as she ordered an immediate review of all my parents' published research and patient files from their practice. She granted emergency custody to the state effective immediately, and ordered psychiatric evaluations for both parents within 72 hours. My father jumped up shouting that they were destroying groundbreaking research that would revolutionize child development, still talking about their work instead of us even as security moved toward him. He yelled about scientific persecution and threatened to sue everyone while officers escorted him out with my mother walking calmly behind him, never once looking at me or Caleb. That evening, our foster mom picked us up from the courthouse and drove us to her small house that smelled like vanilla candles and had photos of her own grown kids everywhere. She made us hot chocolate with extra marshmallows and didn't push when we sat silently on her couch, still processing everything that had happened. Caleb finally asked me in this tiny, broken voice if our parents had ever loved us at all, or if we were always just an experiment to them. I wanted to lie and say of course they loved us, but I couldn't give him false hope that might make him want to go back, so I just held him while he cried. The next morning, Ms. Foster came to check on us at the foster home, bringing our schoolwork and some clothes she'd collected from our house with police supervision. She told us teachers and classmates had been calling nonstop after hearing something had happened, and the whole school was worried about us. I realized our story was spreading through Boulder, and felt sick thinking about Caleb having to go back to school with everyone knowing our parents had tortured us for science. She promised to help manage things at school, and said the principal would make sure no one bothered us with questions when we came back. That afternoon, James called with news that made everything feel more real and more horrible at the same time. 3 other families had contacted authorities after hearing about our case on the news, saying they'd attended my parents' parenting workshops years ago. They'd tried implementing the competition system for a few weeks before realizing it was destroying their children and stopping, but they'd been too ashamed to report it until now. Their testimonies would support the criminal case being built against my parents, and investigators were tracking down more families from workshop attendance records. 2 days later, police executed a search warrant at our house while we stayed at the foster home watching cartoons and pretending to be normal kids. The detective called our lawyer afterward and said they'd found hundreds of hours of video footage documenting 12 years of systematic abuse, all carefully labeled and organized by date. They found notebooks where my parents had rated each child's breakdown threshold and recovery time like we were experiments, with charts tracking how long it took us to cry when we stopped fighting back and how many days of losing it took before I went silent. The detective said in 30 years of working child abuse cases, he'd never seen anyone document their own crimes so thoroughly, like they were proud of what they'd done to us. Thursday morning, Linda picked us up from the foster home and drove us to her office where she had papers spread across her desk about our future. She pulled out a folder and showed us photos of a house in Denver where our Aunt Sarah lived, someone I'd only heard mentioned once when Dad got drunk. Sarah was Dad's sister who'd tried visiting us years ago, but our parents told the neighbors she was mentally unstable and dangerous to keep her away. Linda explained Sarah had been searching for us after seeing news coverage and wanted us to come live with her immediately. Caleb grabbed my hand under the table while Linda talked about new schools and fresh starts and leaving Boulder behind forever. I stared at the photos of Sarah's house with its big backyard and normal-looking kitchen and tried to imagine eating breakfast there without competitions. Linda said we had to decide soon, but I couldn't think straight because my phone kept buzzing with messages from Patricia about an emergency hearing. Our parents' lawyers had filed motions claiming the search was illegal, and we'd been coached to lie about the abuse for attention. They wanted immediate custody returned and supervised visits starting tomorrow, which made me run to the bathroom and throw up. Patricia called while I was washing my face and said the judge scheduled the hearing for Friday morning despite her objections about traumatizing us further. That night, I couldn't sleep and found Caleb standing in my doorway at 2 a.m., shaking from nightmares about competitions where I disappeared. He crawled into my bed sobbing about dreams where he had to choose between keeping me or keeping our parents' love. I held him tight and promised we'd never be separated again, and for the first time, I could actually mean it. Friday morning, we sat in the courtroom hallway while our parents' colleagues filed past us in their suits and avoided eye contact. The prosecutor warned us they'd brought character witnesses, professors who'd worked with our parents for years at the university. Inside the courtroom, our parents sat with 3 lawyers while their witnesses took turns describing them as brilliant researchers and dedicated academics. One professor talked for 10 minutes about their groundbreaking work in attachment theory without ever mentioning they had children. Another colleague praised their innovative thinking and commitment to advancing psychological science through rigorous experimental design. The way those professors talked about attachment theory while ignoring that real children were hurt makes me wonder if they knew what was happening behind closed doors. Did they choose not to see it, or were they fooled too? The third witness, a visiting professor from Stanford, started explaining how she'd consulted with Mom about implementing similar programs. She mentioned Mom had been running online sessions with families across the country, teaching them the competition system through video calls. The prosecutor jumped up asking for details while Mom's lawyer tried to object, but the witness kept talking about the website and payment system. She said Mom charged $500 per session to coach parents through selective attachment exercises with their own kids. The judge ordered an immediate recess while the prosecutor called the FBI about interstate fraud and unlicensed therapy across state lines. Mom's face went white as federal agents arrived within an hour to seize her laptop and files from the house. Monday morning, the university president held a press conference announcing both my parents had been terminated effective immediately for ethics violations. Their department chair claimed he'd never known about the home experiments despite Dad mentioning them at every faculty meeting for years. Other professors released statements distancing themselves, saying they'd only known my parents professionally and had no idea about their parenting methods. Linda brought more FBI agents to interview us that afternoon about the online therapy sessions we'd overheard through the walls. I remembered Mom on video calls late at night, watching other kids compete while their parents took notes and asked questions. I gave them dates and times I'd written in my journal, details about families in Texas and Oregon and New York. Caleb remembered overhearing Mom tell one mother to burn her daughter's stuffed animals as punishment for losing a competition. The agents took notes about everything while Linda held Caleb's hand because he was shaking so hard he could barely speak. Tuesday, our Aunt Sarah flew in from Denver and met us at Linda's office with photo albums we'd never seen before. She showed us pictures of Dad as a kid, before he met Mom, when he still smiled like a normal person. There were photos of grandparents we'd never met, cousins we didn't know existed, a whole family our parents had cut off completely. Sarah cried when she hugged us, saying she'd tried calling child services years ago, but had no proof of anything wrong. She'd hired a private investigator once, but our parents got a restraining order claiming she was harassing them about their parenting choices. That evening, I helped Caleb with his math homework at the foster home, just regular homework without any competition or scoring system. He kept asking if getting a B was okay, if making mistakes meant he'd lose something important. I watched him erase right answers because he thought they weren't perfect enough and realized how deep the damage went. He flinched when I reached over to point at a problem, like he expected me to tear up his paper for doing it wrong. Wednesday morning's news showed our parents' mugshots after their arrest on federal fraud charges for the unlicensed therapy scheme. The headline called them Boulder professors arrested in multi-state child abuse fraud, while their photos stared out from every local news site. Caleb refused to look at the TV and covered his ears when the reporter started talking about the competition system. I felt sick seeing our family's destruction displayed for everyone to judge, but also relieved that people finally knew the truth. Linda called to say more families had come forward, 23 so far, across 8 states who'd paid for Mom's coaching sessions. The prosecutor said they were building a federal case now since the fraud crossed state lines, and I just nodded while watching Caleb pick at the carpet threads in our foster placement living room. 2 weeks passed in a blur of therapy sessions where Aunt Sarah drove down from Denver 3 times a week to sit with us in this small office that smelled like vanilla candles and old books. She kept telling me that losing those competitions wasn't giving up. It was the only way I could fight back against parents who'd rigged the game from the start. But I couldn't stop seeing myself standing in corners for 8 years while Caleb ate dinner. Caleb started getting angry during his sessions, and I could hear him yelling through the thin walls about how he hated winning and hated being their good boy and hated that they made him hurt me. The therapist said this was healthy, but it scared me seeing my little brother finally letting out 12 years of rage he'd swallowed to survive. Linda called one afternoon while we were doing homework to say the tech team found more during their search of the house, and my stomach dropped when she started listing what they'd discovered. Cameras in our bedrooms recording us changing clothes, cameras in the bathroom, recordings of every phone call we'd ever made on the landline, keystroke loggers on our computers tracking everything we typed. The prosecutor added voyeurism charges and something about child exploitation, but I threw up in the foster mom's kitchen sink thinking about them watching me in the shower all those years. 3 days later, we sat in family court for the custody hearing where Aunt Sarah's lawyer explained why she should be our guardian, and everything felt almost normal until the door opened and 2 people I barely recognized walked in. My grandparents looked older than the photos I'd seen, Mom's parents who I hadn't seen since I was 4, and they told Judge Patricia they should get custody because they were blood family. Their lawyer stood up saying, "Doctor, Richard was a good father who just got carried away with his research, and this was all a misunderstanding that could be worked out with family counseling." I wanted to scream, but Aunt Sarah grabbed my hand under the table while Patricia asked them where they'd been for 12 years if they cared so much about our well-being. They admitted Richard cut them off when Caleb was born, said they were toxic influences who'd ruin his parenting experiment, and they'd respected his wishes because they didn't want to cause problems. The judge asked if they'd ever tried to check on us, and they said no. They'd trusted their son to raise his children properly. When court recessed, I followed them into the hallway and asked why they never fought for us, why they just accepted being cut off, why they chose their son over grandchildren they barely knew. My grandmother started crying and said Richard threatened to move across the country if they interfered, and they thought staying nearby was better than losing us completely. My grandfather said they'd been weak and selfish, and he understood if I hated them, but they wanted to make things right now. I told them it was 12 years too late and walked back to Aunt Sarah, who was filling out more paperwork while Caleb sat beside her. The next morning, Caleb had to testify, and I watched him stand up straight for the first time in months, telling Patricia he wanted to live with Aunt Sarah in Denver, where nobody knew about the competitions. He said Boulder made him feel sick, that everywhere he looked reminded him of what our parents did, and he needed to be far away to feel safe. Patricia wrote notes while he talked about having nightmares where he was still competing against me and waking up crying because he thought he'd won again. She asked if he felt safe with Aunt Sarah, and he said yes. She was the first adult who never made him perform for love. 3 weeks dragged by with legal paperwork and custody evaluations before we finally finally got approved to move and started packing our few belongings in the foster placement. The foster mom had gotten attached even though we'd only been there 2 months, and she gave us each a journal, saying we could write new stories now that we were free. She helped us fold clothes into garbage bags since we didn't have suitcases, and made sandwiches for the drive to Denver. Ms. Foster surprised me by organizing a goodbye gathering at school, even though I'd missed so many classes during the legal proceedings. Teachers I barely knew showed up with cards. Classmates who'd never talked to me before said they were proud of me for speaking up, and strangers who'd heard about our story on the news brought gift cards and stuffed animals. Caleb's entire class made him cards with drawings, and his teacher gave him a photo album of their field trips that he hadn't been allowed to go on. It felt weird being seen after so many years of being invisible, and I didn't know how to handle people actually caring about us. 2 days before we were supposed to leave, our parents' lawyer filed an emergency motion claiming that moving us out of state would interfere with their defense preparation. They said they needed us available for depositions and psychological evaluations for their trial. Patricia denied it immediately in a hearing that lasted 12 minutes, stating that the children's welfare and recovery superseded any convenience for the defendants. Their lawyer argued about constitutional rights, but Patricia cut him off, saying the defendants should have considered that before systematically abusing their children for over a decade. That night, I was packing the last box when I found a stack of letters hidden under Caleb's mattress, all addressed to me but never sent. My hands shook as I read his apologies for every competition he'd won, pages of "I'm sorry and I didn't want to" and "I hate myself for hurting you" in his messy handwriting. The last letter made me cry because it said, "I wish we could both lose and run away together," and was dated 3 months ago, right before the final competition announcement. He'd been planning escape too, drawing maps to bus stations and saving lunch money in a sock, but he was too scared to leave me alone with them. Moving day came with news vans outside the foster home because someone leaked that we were leaving Boulder, and reporters wanted comments about the expanding investigation. $500 per session to teach parents how to make their kids compete for love? That's so much money. I'm trying to understand why 23 families would pay to learn something so hurtful. Did they really think this would help their children somehow? Linda told us in the car that 17 more families had filed complaints about our parents' online therapy program, and the FBI was investigating interstate fraud. She said one family in Texas had recorded their sessions where mom coached them through creating competitions between their twins, and another family in Oregon was suing for emotional damages after their kids attempted suicide. Aunt Sarah turned the radio off when they started discussing the case and asked if we wanted to stop for ice cream on the way to Denver, but neither of us were hungry. The rest of the drive took 4 hours, and Caleb slept against my shoulder, while Aunt Sarah kept glancing at us in the rearview mirror with tears in her eyes. When we pulled up to her house in Denver, it looked nothing like the cold modern place our parents had built. Yellow paint peeled off the wooden siding, and the front yard had 3 garden gnomes wearing tiny knitted sweaters. 2 cats watched us from the porch swing, and a golden retriever started barking behind the screen door. Aunt Sarah grabbed our bags and led us inside, where every surface had picture frames and plants and books stacked in crooked piles. She showed Caleb his room first, and he froze in the doorway, staring at soccer posters covering the walls and a bookshelf full of fantasy novels. "I researched what 12-year-old boys like," she said quietly. My room had drama masks painted on the walls and a desk with actual art supplies instead of just the academic materials our parents allowed. That first week, we legally changed our last names to Morrison, which was Mom's maiden name before she became Dr. Reeves. The school secretary helped us fill out enrollment forms and didn't ask questions when I checked the box for free lunch assistance. Caleb joined the soccer team without having to compete against anyone for the spot, and I auditioned for the spring play. The drama teacher said I had natural talent, which made me cry, because no one had ever praised something I wanted to do instead of something I had to win. 3 weeks later, the prosecutor called to schedule a meeting about the criminal trial. She explained it wouldn't happen for 6 months because the defense kept filing motions and requesting delays. I told her I'd testify about everything if it meant protecting Caleb from having to relive it in court. She said she understood and would try to limit his involvement to written statements. That night, we got a call from Linda, who said Mom had tried to overdose on hoarded medication in her jail cell. They found her unconscious during morning count and rushed her to the hospital, where they pumped her stomach. She was on psychiatric hold now with round-the-clock monitoring. Caleb asked if this meant she finally lost a competition, and I didn't know how to answer. 2 months passed with therapy appointments and new routines until everything exploded again. Dad's lawyer had gotten hold of the recordings from our house cameras and edited them to show only me losing competitions on purpose. The news channels played clips of me deliberately failing while a legal expert discussed whether I'd manipulated the whole situation. Caleb saw it on someone's phone at school and had a panic attack so bad they called an ambulance. I held his hand in the emergency room while he hyperventilated into a paper bag. The next morning, James went on every news show with stacks of evidence. He'd analyzed 30 years of our parents' published research and found fabricated data in every single paper. The statistics were impossible, and the case studies described children who didn't exist. Universities started retracting their papers, and the psychology board announced a formal investigation. Former colleagues who'd supported their methods rushed to distance themselves. One professor admitted he'd always suspected something was wrong, but hadn't wanted to challenge such prominent researchers. I spent the next week working with my therapist on a victim impact statement. We went through draft after draft as I tried to explain what they'd stolen from us. I wrote about being 4 years old and excited to be a big sister before they turned it into a competition. I described watching Caleb cry himself to sleep after being forced to say terrible things about me to win. I included the one photo I'd hidden of us together before the competition started when we were just normal siblings. 2 months into our new life in Denver, Aunt Sarah threw Caleb his first real birthday party. She invited his whole soccer team and bought a cake with 13 candles. When everyone started singing happy birthday, Caleb broke down sobbing. Later, he told me he'd never had people celebrate him just for existing without having to earn it. The FBI agent contacted us the following week with disturbing news. They'd found business plans on Dad's computer for franchising their parenting system internationally. There were contracts with investors and training materials for other parents who wanted to implement competitive attachment therapy. They'd been planning to open centers in 12 countries. I testified to the FBI about conversations I'd overheard where they discussed expansion plans and recruitment strategies. They'd talked about creating an app where parents could track competition scores and share successful punishment methods. The agent looked sick as I described their vision for thousands of families using their system. Meanwhile, Dad's psychiatric psychiatric evaluation results came back from the state hospital. The psychiatrist diagnosed him with narcissistic personality disorder and noted his complete lack of remorse. During interviews, he'd insisted his methods would have created a generation of superior children if people hadn't interfered. He blamed me for ruining decades of research by refusing to compete properly. The evaluation was 300 pages, documenting his delusions about being a misunderstood genius whose brilliance would eventually be recognized. The prosecutor's assistant called me 3 weeks later about something Caleb had been doing without telling me. She'd found a stack of video files on a flash drive he'd given her, labeled with dates going back 2 months. I watched the first one in her office while she stepped out to give me privacy. Caleb sat in his bedroom talking to the camera about nightmares where our parents came back and made us compete again. He described waking up screaming and then feeling guilty for disturbing our aunt who'd been nothing but kind to us. In another video, he admitted he still hoarded food in his room because part of him couldn't believe meals would keep coming without having to win them. He talked about therapy helping, but being scared to tell me how hard things still were because I'd already sacrificed so much. The prosecutor said he'd brought them hoping they'd help the case, but made her promise not to tell me unless necessary. I found him in his room that afternoon doing homework and hugged him without saying why. Our Aunt Sarah drove us to family therapy twice a week in her old Honda, playing whatever music we wanted on the way there. The therapist had us do exercises where we shared things without keeping score or comparing who had it worse. She explained that love wasn't like food or money where giving some to one person meant less for another. Caleb struggled with this concept after 12 years of our parents treating affection like a resource that could run out. During one session, he broke down admitting he felt guilty every time Sarah hugged him because it meant she was using up hugs that could go to me instead. The therapist had Sarah demonstrate by hugging us both at the same time, showing there was no limit, no competition, just love. 4 months into living in Denver, I got an acceptance letter from CU Denver's summer pre-college engineering program. It was the first thing I'd ever achieved just for myself without it being about protecting Caleb or surviving our parents. That same week, Caleb made the middle school honor roll and Sarah took us to a restaurant to celebrate. We sat there eating dessert without anyone keeping track of who got more ice cream or whose achievement was bigger. The prosecutor called the next morning with news that made my hands shake. They'd found Dr. Margaret's private journal in a safety deposit box, filled with detailed plans that went far beyond what we'd endured. She'd written about studying us through college, arranging marriages with children from other client families who'd been through the same system, then documenting the third generation. There were charts showing which traits she wanted to breed together, and notes about getting research grants to follow the subjects for 50 years. One entry described us as specimens and data points, rather than children. She'd never seen us as her kids at all, just an experiment she'd birthed herself to ensure complete control. The trial started 6 months after we'd left Boulder, in a courthouse that smelled like old coffee and floor wax. I testified for 3 hours, keeping my voice steady as I described 12 years of competitions, punishments, and watching my brother slowly break. I looked directly at my parents while explaining how I'd chosen to lose every competition to protect Caleb from sleeping in the garage or going hungry. Dr. Richard shook his head like I was lying, but Dr. Margaret just stared at the wall behind me with empty eyes. The defense attorney tried to twist everything during cross-examination, suggesting I was a troubled teen who resented my younger brother getting attention. I responded by listing every single act of kindness I'd done in secret, every meal I'd skipped so Caleb could eat, every night I'd slept on concrete so he could have a bed, every birthday I'd spent alone so he could have parents. The courtroom was silent when I finished, except for a juror wiping her eyes. Caleb insisted on testifying even though I begged him not to put himself through it. What made them think they could breed children like some kind of science experiment? Reading through Dr. Margaret's journal must have been so strange, planning marriages between kids from different families who went through the same awful treatment. He sat in that witness chair looking so small and told the jury exactly what our parents had made him do. His voice cracked when he said they'd made him hurt the only person who ever really loved him and that I'd saved his life by losing. Several jury members were crying openly by the time he described burning photos of us together while our parents took notes on his emotional response. Other families who'd attended the workshops testified next about the damage the system had caused. A father broke down completely describing how he'd nearly lost his children to CPS after implementing the methods for just 3 months. A mother explained how her kids still couldn't eat meals together without fighting because they'd been trained to see food as something to compete for. The prosecutor presented evidence of 12 families in therapy, 6 divorces, and 3 suicide attempts linked directly to the workshops. During closing arguments, the defense tried to paint my parents as misguided academics whose theories went too far, but who loved their children in their own way. The prosecution responded by playing 12 years of footage, showing children sobbing, begging for food, sleeping on floors, and slowly losing their ability to trust anyone. The final image they showed was Caleb at 8 years old, throwing our photos into the fire while tears streamed down his face, and our parents calmly documented his breakdown. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours before returning their verdict, guilty on all counts including child abuse, child endangerment, fraud, and conspiracy to commit child abuse. Dr. Richard showed absolutely no emotion as each guilty verdict was read. Dr. Margaret looked around the courtroom like she was confused about why she was there, as if she genuinely couldn't understand how her research had led to criminal charges. The judge sentenced them to 15 years each and terminated their parental rights permanently. Judge Patricia stood up from her bench and looked directly at my parents while the bailiff moved closer to them. She said they had perverted the sacred trust of parenthood in pursuit of academic glory, and that no child should ever be treated as an experiment. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the court reporter's fingers on her keyboard. Judge Patricia's voice got harder as she explained that my parents would serve their sentences in separate facilities and would never have contact with children again. My parents just sat there like they were watching someone else's trial. The bailiff put handcuffs on them and started leading them out through the side door. Dr. Richard looked back at us once, but his face was completely blank like we were strangers. Dr. Margaret kept staring at the wall like she was still trying to figure out what went wrong with her research. I thought I'd feel something when they took them away, but I just felt empty. 12 years of fighting for survival doesn't just disappear because someone says justice has been served. Caleb grabbed my hand so tight it hurt, but I didn't pull away. Outside the courthouse, the reporters were waiting with their cameras and microphones. Caleb pressed his face against my shoulder to hide from the flashing lights. He asked me quietly if we could visit them in prison someday. I told him maybe when when he was older if he wanted to. He looked up at me with tears running down his face and said he just wanted to ask them why we weren't enough as we were. I didn't have an answer for that question because I'd been asking it myself for years. Sarah put her arms around both of us and guided us to her car while Linda blocked the reporters. A week later, the media attention finally started dying down and we could go back to something like normal life in Denver. Sarah had enrolled us in schools near her house and they gave us extra counseling support to help us adjust. The other kids stared at us sometimes because everyone had seen the news stories, but mostly they left us alone. Sarah fielded all the interview requests and told everyone we needed privacy to heal. She turned our phones off and put a sign on the door saying no media allowed. Caleb's new school had an after-school program where kids could play games and do homework together. I picked him up one afternoon and found him teaching another boy how to play checkers. He was explaining the rules patiently without any mention of winning or losing. The other kid made a bad move and Caleb just smiled and showed him a better option. They were both laughing and taking turns without keeping score. I stood in the doorway watching my little brother break the cycle our parents had forced on us. Maybe we really would be okay someday. Dr. James called us a few weeks later with an idea he'd been working on. He wanted to establish a fund for therapy and education for all the families affected by our parents' workshops. He asked if he could name it after me and Caleb to show that something positive could come from our suffering. Sarah helped us think about it and we decided to agree if it would help other kids heal. The fund would pay for counseling and tutoring and anything else the families needed to recover. 6 months into our new life in Denver, I still couldn't completely relax. Sarah would hug us both at the same time, and I'd freeze up waiting for someone to say there wasn't enough love for two kids. She noticed every time and just held us tighter while whispering that we were both her precious kids. Caleb would lean into the hugs, but I could feel my whole body tensing up. Years of training doesn't just go away because someone tells you it's safe now. Sarah never pushed or got frustrated when I pulled away. She just kept showing us every day that there was always enough room for both of us. Caleb started going to a support group for kids who'd been through abuse. He came home lighter after each meeting like someone was lifting weights off his shoulders. He'd tell me about the other kids and how they understood what it felt like to not trust adults. The group leader taught them that what happened wasn't their fault and that they deserved to be loved. I watched my brother slowly become the confident kid he should have always been. His laugh got louder and his smile got bigger and he stopped looking over his shoulder all the time. I started writing everything down in journals late at night when I couldn't sleep. Not for anyone else to read, but just to try to make sense of parents who saw their own children as experiments. I filled notebook after notebook with memories both good and bad from before Caleb was born. Writing helped me see patterns I hadn't noticed before and understand how sick our parents really were. The words on the page couldn't hurt me the way the memories in my head did. On the 1-year anniversary of leaving Boulder, we had a small ceremony in Sarah's backyard. Sarah had gotten copies of all our parents' published papers about their twisted parenting theory. We built a small fire in the fire pit and took turns throwing the papers in. Caleb watched his handful burn and said goodbye to the parents we wished we'd had. Then we planted a tree together in the corner of the yard. Sarah said it would grow strong with proper care and love, just like we would. We watered it together and Caleb made a little sign with our names and the date. Now I watch Caleb playing soccer with the neighborhood kids every weekend. He laughs and shouts and celebrates without calculating who deserves joy more than someone else. He shares his snacks and helps kids who fall down, and nobody tells him that's weakness. I've applied to colleges for next fall, and I'm planning a future neither of us could have imagined a year ago. Sarah calls us in for dinner, and there's always enough food and enough chairs and enough love for both of us. We're finally learning to believe it. Thanks for tagging along with me today. This one was a wild little ride, huh? Loved wondering and digging into all of it with you. Until next time. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.